Hi, everybody. So I get the fun part of the day. I get to introduce our keynote speaker, born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, from the Valley, and I'm a fellow Valleyite, so I'm really excited to introduce him. Dr. Felipe Hinojosa is an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University. He received his bachelor's degree in English from Fresno Pacific University, his master's degree in history from UT Pan American, and his PhD in history from the University of Houston. His research interests include Chicano, and Latino studies, American religion, and social movements. In addition to serving as the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the History Department and as Director of the Carlos H. Cantu Hispanic Education and Opportunity Endowment, Professor Hinojosa is editor for the interdisciplinary, peer-reviewed, and online moderated forum, Latinx Talk. His work has appeared in many publications, including the Western Historical Quarterly, American Catholic Studies, and in edited collections on Latinx studies. Dr. Hinojosa's first book, Latino Mennonites, Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press and was awarded the 2015 Americo Paredes Book Award for the best book in Mexican American and Latino Studies by the Center of Mexican American Studies at South Texas College. Please help me welcome with your virtual claps, Dr. Felipe Hinojosa.
All right, so I unmuted. Can everybody hear me? Am I on? All right, okay, great. So good morning, everyone from College Station, Texas, from my home here in College Station. But as Cassie mentioned, all of, my family is in South Texas and in Brownsville. And I think especially with everything that's going on now, my heart is in the Valley these days a whole lot. And I hope that your family and friends are safe during these unprecedented times. I just want to say that it's a real honor for me to be here with you all this morning. And I want to start out by thanking the leadership at the Texas Association of Chicanos in Higher Education for this invitation. And really, I think for the chosen theme this year, the idea and notion of thriving in times of change brought forth for me Octavia Butler's words in her book, Parable of the Sower. And in it, she writes, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." And, given everything that we're currently experiencing, change is now more real and more accelerated than perhaps any of us have ever experienced. Even our notions of community, as already has been mentioned in the introductions, our ways of connecting have changed as we practice social distancing and as we wear masks to protect each other. And I'd like to suggest too, that change is at the center of how we identify. The terms that we use to propel our movements for social change, from whether we prefer Chicana or Chicano or Hispanic, to movements that are doing away with terms that they feel are out of date. Just look at the recent move by MECHA, the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, to remove Chicano and Aztlán from their name, a move that, as many of you probably know, sparked a spirited debate around identity and around the terms that we use, but that nonetheless was overwhelmingly supported by MECHA chapters. Today's generation and the students that I teach, the students that I know you all teach and work with as well, is once again grappling with how best to build coalitions across race, gender, class, and citizenship and sexuality. And the most recent iterations of Chicanx and Latinx are a testament to this, as both terms have gained currency in the last few years. Now, I know that my title is somewhat bold, Chicano, past, present, and future of a political identity. And I've only got like 20 or so minutes, so I'm gonna try to hurry through this as best I can. But understand that there's no way that I can cover all of the angles and complexities of the term Chicano, and it's in, sort of the present and the past and in the future. But I do want to argue centrally that from the 1960s, when Chicano and Chicana became the way young people in the movement identified, that this identity has been struggling for and working toward a better barrio, a city, a better region, and a better world. Now, I say that because it's important to understand that the movement's political commitments have not just been defensive or reactionary, but also about projecting a new and fresh vision forward. And this is why Chicana and Chicano studies as fields of academic study remain so vibrant. You could argue Latina and Latino studies becoming even more so across the United States. Our classes at Texas A&M University, for example, whenever we teach Latina or Latino history or Chicana history, are always some of the first to fill up, because we all believe and we all know that when you study this history, when you know your history, it breathes life into the past and it speaks it into the future. Now, my job at Texas A&M is to make sure that students of all backgrounds understand the relevance and power of the Chicano movement and its engagements with Black, Puerto Rican, Native, and Asian movements for freedom and civil rights. This was by no means an isolated movement. And I do this as an historian and as a social movement scholar, and as someone who, like me, who grew up in Brownsville, Texas in the 1980s and in the 1990s, really a beneficiary of the work and struggle of Chicanas and Chicanos that came before me. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge that as I speak about this work and as I speak about the power of this history. When I teach Chicana and Chicano history, it's tied directly to freedom movements and to the desires of Chicanas and Chicanos to be free and to dream of a new world. And so that's how I'll talk about this identity today. I wonder, like me, how often you all get the question, what does Chicano mean? And who gets to call themselves a Chicano, right? I get it all the time. As I'm sure you do as well. I'll never forget sitting in an undergraduate Mexican-American history class at UT Pan American before I got into the master's classes. I had to take some undergrad history classes. And so I'm there sitting at UT Pan American in Edinburgh, watching that PBS documentary, Chicano. I don't know if you all remember that. It was produced in the late 90s, very popular series. And I was in Dr. Roberto Salmon's class. If you were at UT Pan American in those days, you remember Dr. Salmon. I remember we were watching the video of the school walkouts in 1968 in Los Angeles. And when it got to that moment, when one of the teachers, Sal Castro, whose name you might recognize, he says in that documentary, he says, on the day that the students walked out, they walked out with their heads held high. He said, it was a beautiful day to be a Chicano that day. And he starts to break down, he starts to actually get emotional as he's saying that. I remember everything about that particular moment and Castro's words in particular, because up until that time, I had never heard anyone talk about Chicano in such a beautiful way and in such an emotional way. I was struck, and it was a moment that I will never forget. And when I try to define Chicano with my students and others, I typically tend to start with the question of origins, which is muddy and it's difficult to do so. But that's how we'll start today, and we'll see how it goes. There are several origin stories in terms of where the term actually comes from, but the one that took on the most significance for Chicano movement leaders was cited in a linguistic study in 1978 by a scholar named Tino Villanueva, who noted that the term's origins lie in pre-conquest native folks, native people in Mexico, the Mexicas. Spaniards would hear this term and would hear this name, but would render that SH sound as an X, according to their own pronunciations. So it became more Mexicano. And so the native population who continued to use Mexica later became Mexicano or Mexicana, and later that becomes Chicanos. And so for a group that is identifying more with their indigenous roots, this interpretation really began to take relevance. But there are several others I won't necessarily get into that talk about the origins of such a term. We know that in sort of a more contemporary use of the term and over time, it has come to be defined very strictly and very narrowly as an American of Mexican descent. But it is clear that this identity is more than just ethnicity. There's also a political edge to the term and to this identity. The noted Los Angeles Times journalist Ruben Salazar gave us perhaps, I think, one of the clearest definitions when he wrote early in 1970 that, quote, "A Chicano is a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself." In Texas, the Bejar County Commissioner, Alberto Peña, was right to highlight in 1970 that, quote, "The Chicano is more determined and more militant. He is no longer asking, he is demanding." That move to demand and to not ask formed a clear departure from the Mexican Americanism of groups such as the League of United Latin American Citizens and the American GI Forum, whose liberalism was perceived to be out of date by the middle of the 1960s. In other words, to be Chicana and Chicano meant that you were fed up with gradual politics that seemed to be focused only on legislative actions, and fed up with working within the system to change the system. Chicana and Chicano also constituted an entirely new image of oneself, a rejection of whiteness, an embrace of our indigenous roots, and a solidarity with other freedom movements across the United States and the world, and a radical redefinition of the roles of women and the family in the movement. It was and is most clearly a political identity, a philosophy of struggle that emphasizes ethnic, cultural, and linguistic pride. The Chicano movement era asserted a political identity away from the gaze of white people who saw them and treated them as not fully human and as second-class citizens. The eternal questions of ¿Quién soy y quiénes somos? Were central to this movement, and for good reason. Chicana and Chicano movements, whether you're talking about the school walkouts in Los Angeles, the United Farm Worker Movement strike that started in Delano in 1965, or the Mexican American Youth Organization in Houston, drew on their own histories, on their own community histories for inspiration, but they also looked to other groups. They looked to the Black Panther Party. They looked to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and anti-colonial movements in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and Cuba for encouragement and for solidarity. One of the aspects of the movement that we know probably very little about has more to do with the internationalism of the Chicana and Chicano movement. And these movements were bold in their critiques of police brutality, economic exploitation, and the sexist and racist rhetoric that demonized Chicanas and Chicanos as indolent, criminal, and perpetually foreign. And as we can see in today's context, this is what the current person sitting in the White House, this is how he started his campaign, demonizing Mexican immigrants. And it's interesting to note that in that demonization that he started his campaign in, we understood even the way that he used Mexican as a way to mean all people of Latin American descent. It wasn't just Mexicanos and Mexicanas who took his comment as an offense. It was all people of Latin American descent who saw themselves represented in that way of being perceived to be criminal, rapists, and otherwise. Of course, when you think about the identity, it also came with an ideological edge that projected an intense ethnic nationalism. The notion that mi raza viene primero, my people first, that carried with it a machismo that dominated sectors of the movement and placed culture and race over gender oppression. And yet the movement saw the rise of Chicana feminism, the acknowledgement and push to recognize the important role of women from the colonial period to the present. Chicanas expanded the notion of this identity and forced the movement to recognize gender and class oppression just as much as it was recognizing race and cultural oppression. And even as we grapple with these complexities of Chicano nationalism, what we tend to sort of think about the more radical wing of the movement, we must also be ready to live with and understand the movement's reformist tendencies and the ways in which radical politics, this notion of redefining and rethinking society, negotiated and worked alongside more reformist goals. In other words, just because the Chicano movement emerged did not mean that LULAC went silent or that reformist organizations completely disappeared. But why should that be surprising, right? When we think about the tensions of reformist and radical work are alive today, they've always been there. But perhaps because we only see Chicano as sort of this radical, bold, and irreverent politics, we often miss these negotiations and the ways in which it worked with different populations. The truth is that Chicanas and Chicanos, radicals and reformers, and internationalists took their work very, very seriously. And that meant forging alliances. That meant working with multiple groups. That meant Chicana and Chicano activists from Houston taking a bus up to Chicago in late 1968 to meet Puerto Rican activists and to meet African American activists so that they could find inspiration as they came back to their movement in Houston. And as we think about nationalism being that expression of a community that was tired of being ignored, a community that clearly understood that to the broad American public, Chicanos and Chicanas simply did not matter. The other side of that, though, is that the everyday workings of it were much more reformist and much more complicated than I think we often give them credit for. And even as Chicanas and Chicanos rejected assimilation and rejected American or even Mexican American identity, Chicana and Chicano is nonetheless a uniquely American identity. As much as activists shunned Americanism in naming themselves Chicanos and Chicanas as a point of pride and self-reclamation, they did a very American thing. Chicano helped encapsulate the experience of Mexicans in the United States, an experience that for too long had been ignored. And even as it characterized the experience of Mexicans living in the United States, it did so also for people who were not people of Mexican descent, or even Mexicans who did not grow up socialized in the United States. People like Eleazar Risco, who was of Cuban descent, who was the editor and writer of La Raza newspaper in Los Angeles, and who later established Chicano studies at Fresno State. And Mexican immigrants, like the activist from Houston, Yolanda Garza Birdwell, who in 1969 helped to organize and to lead the Mexican American Youth Organization in Houston, or Mayo, what we know of as Mayo or Barrio Mayo. There were two different chapters in Houston. In an interview with historian Tom Krenick in the 1980s, another Mayo activist, a good friend of Yolanda, an activist by the name of Greg Salazar, noted that when he first met Yolanda, she, quote, stuck out like a sore thumb. Here, and this is Gregory talking, he says, here is this very Mexican-like and bourgeoisie-looking woman in the middle of all of these crazies from the north side, speaking her perfect Spanish and broken English, Salazar commented. Birdwell was born and raised in Mexico in the northern state of Tamaulipas and lived there until the age of 18 when she moved to Houston, and not long after found herself in the middle of a growing Chicano movement in Houston. To be Chicana and Chicano in the 1960s was to be free and to see and identify yourself as part of a larger movement to change the world. And I don't say that to exaggerate by any means. Just look at the academic programs that have come from this movement, the bilingual education programs, the art, the music, poetry, car culture, and perhaps most importantly, a radical tradition that continues to nourish our movement to this day. The other thing I want to note is that even as dominant as Chicano was, as this identity was in the 1960s and 70s, it's interesting to note that even then it was a contested term. The community response outside of those in the student movement was often mixed around who could identify as Chicano and Chicana, from indifference to sometimes outright hostility. In the 1970s, the anthropologist José Limón noted that in general, the term was not very popular among folks outside of the movement. In one essay, Limón cited the work of Nicolás Valenzuela at the University of Texas, who in 1973 found that only 6% of the 1,500 people who were sampled in San Antonio and Austin actually used the term. So which terms were most popular? Mexicano and Mexicana, as a study found that nearly 43% identified as such. That figure should not surprise us, given that even today, people tend to identify mostly by their national origins. That's something that, even as we understand how people sort of choose different identities versus Latino and Hispanic, that people still tend to stick to their national identities for the most part. And the low popularity of Chicano, Limón found, was not a middle-class phenomenon. It wasn't business owners or wealthier people. Working class folks, by and large, also rejected the term or simply did not use it to self-identify. And there are reasons for this. The anthropologist Manuel Gamio identified it as a derogatory term, referring to lower socioeconomic recent immigrants from Mexico in the 1930s. It had negative connotations during this time as well. Yet even as unpopular as it was, Chicano and Chicana came to define a generation, really to define a movement and an entire philosophy of struggle. And it is this idea that continues to captivate students from all Latin American backgrounds to this day. In the present moment, where people are marching in support of Black lives and protesting against children in cages and family separation, demand for Chicano studies is high. And I should add, students are especially interested in the radical movements, the Chicano and Chicana Brown Berets, the Puerto Rican Young Lords in New York City and in Chicago, groups that emulated the Black Panthers and worked directly with the community to make change. And these students that are doing this today, the students that are in my classroom, in your classrooms, and the ones that are most active are not simply from Houston, San Antonio, or the Valley. They are increasingly from unexpected places. They're from Katy, they're from Corsicana, they're from Fort Worth, and they're from Round Rock and Bryan, Texas. They are urban and rural. And this is a generation that's yearning for a history, really for a tradition that they can stake their identity. And so for many, this starts with the Chicana and Chicano movement. And in this sense, what I've seen in my 10 years of teaching at Texas A&M is that Chicana and Chicano history and politics is a starting point for many, not an end point. And that call for Chicano history, for a more complete American story, has been answered forcefully by community leaders, by scholars, politicians, many of you that are on this Zoom meeting today. Parents who in the last few years made Mexican American studies a reality in Texas schools. And this is fundamentally important because as scholars who study movements, who study these student movements today tell us, today's freshman class is more likely to participate in student-led protests than in each of the 5 decades preceding it, including freshmen from the 1960s and the 1970s. And that's a phenomenal thing if you think about it, because we have an idea of the 60s and 70s as a time of social and political unrest and student movements. And yet today's generation is more likely to be marching and so forth, even more so than during that time. And I've seen it firsthand at Texas A&M University, a campus with a history of white supremacy and anti-Black and anti-Mexican sentiment. Aggies, what I was told when I first arrived to Texas A&M was that Aggies do not protest. And nothing could be further from the truth, at least as I have found it. In the last 10 years, student movements have made it possible to finally institute a Latina and Latino Mexican American Studies minor for our students. And while our campus is without question 50 years behind, there's no question that it is Latina and Latino and Chicano students that are at the forefront making this happen from all across our state and all across the country. And the visions and demands of students, and now the many athletes, as you have seen in the past few weeks, the athletes that are joining them, all of these visions and demands, if you're watching from the outside, seem to be impossible. And if you know anything about Texas A&M, seem to be impossible. Right now, there's a movement on campus to take down the statue of a Confederate general and known white supremacist, Sully Ross. You might have been following this news. An idea that only a year ago seemed far-fetched now has the attention of university leadership at the highest levels. I want to suggest that it is those radical visions that move us to where we want to be. Yes, we want policy change. Yes, we will take the cases to the courts. Yes, we will march. But Chicana and Chicano politics and Chicano identity was never solely about just being defensive or being reactionary against what is happening. It is also about projecting and offering a new future. The idea that another world is possible, the notion that Chicano studies can exist and thrive as an academic field of study, and the belief that Confederate statues must come down. And part of that radical vision links politics and freedom to mothering, to domestic and reproductive labor, to art, music, poetry, religion, and in the impulse to build inter-ethnic coalitions and support the movement for Black lives. Look at the work of a collective of mothers in academia called Chicana Mother Work, the movement to establish Mexican American studies in Texas for a new generation of Latina and Latino school children, the music that I love of bands like Chicano Batman that just in their name bring together the worlds of politics and pop culture, or that popular Netflix series that we've hopefully all seen by now, Gentefied, right? A group of young people pushing back against gentrification in Los Angeles. All of these present new and inspiring visions of Chicana and Chicano politics in familiar places in the West and in new places like my campus at Texas A&M. Now, I know that for some, Chicana and Chicano is out of date, that it's irrelevant. It's probably too radical. Maybe it's too working class. But my understanding of Chicana and Chicano is that it is unapologetic, that it does not need the approval of the majority. It really never has. And that Chicana and Chicano freedom is freedom for all. And that matters because it's those radical visions, what the historian Robin D.G. Kelly called freedom dreams, that have opened doors for us to do our work at the academic level, at the legislative level, and at the community level. Nothing happens without that interaction of reformist and revolutionary politics. Without those visions, without a radical view of what we wish for and dream for, and how do we know what it is we're fighting for? Those murals that you see, that graffiti, that artwork on the street, those are reminders to all of us to keep fighting. You saw the beautiful, the way that they painted the streets of Washington, D.C., and I think this has happened in New York City, the painting of Black Lives Matter, right, across the street. That artwork, that projection, that idea, that movement is a way to keep reminding us of what it is that we're fighting for, reminding us to keep working for freedom. They are reminders to be who it is that you are called to be as educators. Chicano and Chicana as a political identity, as a philosophy, as a worldview is not about recognizing some utopian history or a brief moment of radicalism where everybody had their fists in the air in the 1960s. It is about a commitment to social justice, to community care, to style and fashion, but of course it is, right? To food, to really good food, and a never-ending belief that another world is indeed possible. Yes, Chicana and Chicano is a nod to the past, but it is also a vision forward, a representation of the new places, experiences, and sounds of culture. We need that culture work now more than ever to remind us that we will survive. And as the theme for today's conference reminds us, that we will thrive, that we will continue to struggle even in the midst of the chaos that the world lives in today. That's the future of Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx. May you all be safe. Thank you.
So Felipe, this is Daniel Villanueva, and I'd tell you that the room would have a standing ovation right now if we were indeed in a room. But the silence is not indicative of the information and the passion that you shared with us today regarding this. We really appreciate the historical context that you provided, as well as the subtle challenges to this group in maintaining a movement that is non-apologetic. So at this point, we're going to have a couple of questions. I think we've got about 9 minutes. So I'm going to look through the chat box here and see if there are any questions. I know I put a question in, and speaking of Texas A&M, it's a dear place to me. I love Texas A&M, and to see that Eric Mendoza was selected as the student body president, right, the first Latino who joined FACHE last year in February for one of our webinars, was really an amazing feat for Texas A&M, right? But one of the questions that I had that I put in there, and certainly if you have questions, please put them in the box here, is about where the movement is today. You sort of ended it at the end with the notion that there are more Latinos in education who are wanting this Mexican American or Chicano movement education, but where do you see the movement going, and how can participants that are in this professional development day take your information and mobilize themselves in their own areas of emphasis in higher ed to make sure that this continues?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think it's one that when I look at the student body, the students that I teach, the students that I work with, and I even spent a year teaching in Georgia, in Atlanta, which was probably, in terms of students of Latin American descent, was one of the more diverse classrooms that I had ever taught. There were students from Washington Heights in New York City, Puerto Rican students, Colombian, Nicaragüenses, Guatemaltecos, Salvadoreños y Salvadoreñas in that class. And here we're talking about the Chicano movement, and in some cases also the Puerto Rican movement. And I think what today's movement is really striving for is working to build these coalitions with multiple groups to try to build a way forward and to try to gain a sense for who we are. And more so, when you start to do that, you start to ask questions of who are we? Where do, I mean, all of the questions that I get now around the movement for Black Lives Matter are around, students that are wanting to learn their own history, students of Latin American descent that are wanting to learn their own history. So it becomes more crucial than ever to teach about these movements. And one of the things that it's forcing us to do, I think, as scholars and as educators, is to then go and understand the ways in which these activists themselves were also dreaming about building these coalitions and thinking about working with Puerto Ricans, working with African Americans, Asian Americans, Native folks. That's a whole area of scholarship and research that we still have yet to do. And our students today are demanding it because they want models. They want a way forward, a way to sort of think about how it is that we build a politics for the future that is about anti-racism as much as it is a critique of capitalism, as much as it is understanding a variety of sexualities and orientations, where we can all thrive in rapidly changing contexts. That puts, people like myself and those of us that teach, many of you that are on here, in the position of saying, you know what, we don't know everything. Oftentimes, as a matter of fact, when I would lecture on New York City, here I am, a Chicano kid from Brownsville. What do I know about New York City and Puerto Ricans in New York City other than what I've read in books and so forth? And so when I'd have students that were from there, I'd say, let's teach this, let's co-teach this. Let's talk about what it's like to be Puerto Rican, to be Afro-Latino or Latina in New York City. Tell me about your experiences and we can combine this. And so I think as educators, it's opening ourselves up to understanding that we've got a long way to go and a lot to learn. And the students are really leading the way in this regard. Anyway, I hope I answered your question, but I see that notion of building these coalitions more so than ever. And to see that at Texas A&M, where I've been now for 10 years is really a beautiful thing.
Okay, we got a couple of other questions. Folks want to know how they can keep in contact with you via social media. I think Dr. Rincones shared your Twitter handle. You and I are certainly connected on multiple platforms on social media, so I keep up with you. But how can others, perhaps in the chat box here, follow you, stay in touch with you via social media?
You know what? I'm everywhere. And on Instagram, especially, I tend to post a lot of pictures. And so if you want to follow me on Instagram, that would be great. But yeah, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm not as good on Twitter. I think that's like a learned skill. Like you really have to be good at that. I do it every once in a while, but I love, you know, following other scholars and seeing what's coming out and what people are talking about and so forth, because again, the students that I teach are on Twitter. They're on these social media platforms. And if I am not up on that stuff, then I'm really, you know, behind. And so, yeah, I'd love it if anybody wants to keep in touch. Certainly you can email me, but I'd love to get to know all of you. You know, unfortunately, we're in this situation now, but hopefully sometime in the future, I can meet some of you all.
Sure. So another question is, how can Tache support you as a professional in your work, both at Texas A&M and in the area of Mexican American Studies or Chicano? How could you see Tache being able to support you in your work?
Well, I think, you know, even when I was a graduate student at the University of Houston, go Cougs, right? When I was there, it was always Tache was always a part of the conversation. We always knew that Tache, you know, supported the work that we were doing. And I think, you know, having representation and coming together like this and organizing the workshops in the way that you all have organized them, I think is really a phenomenal thing, because it allows then our students, those of us who need support, and we all need it, to be able to know that we've got an organization that we can go to in case we have concerns around our safety on campus or in other places. And so just the vision, the existence, the work, the education, the continuing ed, the professionalism really of Tache and the organization and what it exudes, I think is wonderful for a lot of us that sometimes feel like we're alone out here. To have this bigger community means the world, I know, to me and to a lot of us.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about your new book and put a plug in? Tell us where we can get it, how much it cost, and give us a synopsis of what we have to look forward to.
Yeah, so if you go to my Instagram, which is at South Texas Forever, because of course it is, you know, there's a link to the book. The book will drop January 2021. The title is Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio, published by the University of Texas Press. And it's really sort of an interesting, I look at, and I would encourage you all, if you're teaching a Latino history class or a Latino studies class in the spring, consider assigning it, because what I do is I take two movements from the Chicano movement and two movements from the Puerto Rican movement in four major cities, Houston, so I talk about Mayo in the north side, and Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City. And in each of those places, I talk about how these radical activists and freedom fighters defended off, in some cases, what was urban renewal, or what we know today as gentrification, In the case of Houston, it was white flight and folks leaving, downtown and all that to go and live in these new suburbs that were being developed and the highways that were being created in Houston in the 1960s. And it's the story of how these activists, in order to sort of rethink neighborhood or rethink barrio, occupied churches. Because if you think about it, churches are empty, really. And this was the critique of Puerto Ricans and Chicanos and Chicanas, was that churches were empty from Monday to Saturday. So why can't we use the building? Why can't we use the building to do community classes, to have a breakfast program, just like the Black Panthers did? These are spaces that we can use for community development in an era where Nixon had been elected president. The country was in supposed chaos, much like we are today. And here are people saying the government's not going to come in to save us. There's really very little that we can do. We've got to take it into our own hands in order to help our community. And so it's a beautiful thing, especially what happened in Houston, where they occupied the Juan Marcos Presbyterian Church in the north side, and had the support of the parents. Mothers, fathers, grandparents were there. They would cook breakfast for kids. About 40 kids would eat breakfast at the church every morning, and they occupied it for about 21 days. And it's a beautiful story, I think, of community resilience. And I think in a moment where we're all trying to figure out what's going to happen next and where we're going to be and all of that, it's a reminder that we've got to take care of each other. And it's a reminder that hopefully once this thing passes and we can come together as a community again and see each other, that there's still going to be a lot of work to do. And that's going to mean people in neighborhoods and in communities looking out for each other and taking care of each other. And that's what this book is all about. And it teaches you a little bit about the Puerto Rican and Chicano movements along the way. So go get it. I think it's on pre-order now. On my link in Instagram, there's a discount code that you can use if you want to pre-order it.
Man, I'm teaching a Mexican-American history course this fall, and if I could get an advanced copy, I could make sure to include it in my class. So consider that. But we have to move on, and I just want to take an opportunity to really thank you for the history lesson. You're such an engaging speaker, so energetic, and I can speak for all the colleagues here in the chat box that they have really appreciated your time and your commitment to this work, and your passion is really displayed through the lecture and through the knowledge base that you have regarding the subject. So we really just genuinely appreciate it. When I'm in College Station next, I'm going to hit you up dinner and make sure that we continue the conversation. So thank you. For sure. If anybody else, in College Station, we're kind of alone out here. There's a great group of faculty colleagues that I have out here. Some of you may know who they are. It's a really superstar group of folks out here. But if you're ever out here, let us know. We'll all get together. We'll treat you right. We'll barbecue. We'll go out to eat. We'll do something fun. All 6 of them at Texas A&M are there. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.